Joining me live now to discuss the latest in US politics is New York Post, Washington DC Bureau Chief Josh Christenson. Josh, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
You mentioned you had a bit of a commotion just a short time ago. Lots happening outside the White House now that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's in town. What's been happening, and are they any closer to working out a ceasefire when it comes to the Gaza conflict?
Well, there's certainly been a flurry of activity around the White House the past few days. The Prime Minister arrived early Monday morning and has been staying at Blair House nearby. Many of the streets have been closed off, and he was at the White House Monday. Today, he spent most of the day talking with leaders on Capitol Hill. He had a meeting with House Speaker Mike Johnson. Not a lot of details emerged from that. There was a brief statement that he put out to the press when he exited, discussing some of the red lines for Israel as they continue to talk about, moving toward a ceasefire here with Hamas. Hamas last week was more open to the ceasefire agreement that had been proposed by the envoy Steve Witkoff. But as it looks right now, it seems that there's still going to need to be more negotiations before they agree to any final terms.
I want to get your thoughts on the other big conflict too, the Russian conflict. We've seen Donald Trump direct some pretty fiery words at Vladimir Putin after he launched his biggest aerial attack on Ukraine since the war began. Right after that call with Donald Trump, is the US president's involvement here assisting or hindering? And how much closer are we to get some kind of resolution here?
Well, what we learned today is that the president's patience is wearing very thin. He called out the Russian president's BS with respect to the current state of the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. He was not very pleased with the massive attack that occurred recently, and he was discussing things with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky last Friday. So it looks like the current state of those negotiations is an even more perilous place than what has been discussed with respect to the Gaza conflict. But we know that, many of the diplomats are still trying to reach some sort of an agreement. And we know that, Trump is basically looking to make this one of the key foreign policy wins of his second administration. So he's furiously been discussing these things with his aides and with the various diplomats and hoping to reach some kind of an agreement, ideally in the near future.
Donald Trump copped a bit of criticism for his spray at the Ukrainian leader Zelensky. Is a lot of this tit for tat regarding his relationship with Putin? Is that down to real disagreements with Putin, or is he trying to show public perception that he's now more supportive of Ukraine, redirecting aid there, of course?
His actions tell you that he has changed his tactic throughout this conflict since he's taken office. You saw last week that there was a move to pause some weapons shipments to Ukraine that he eventually overrode, and that he decided that Ukraine did need more weapons. Ukraine did need Patriot missiles. And so that's definitely a change in posture from the administration and something to keep an eye out for as these negotiations continue.
Got to get your thoughts on tariffs. It's really what we're talking about here in Australia at the moment. The fact that the president's threatening to impose new 50% tariffs on copper and potentially 200% on pharmaceutical products. How is this tariff issue being received in the United States?
Well, a lot of the discussion on tariffs is both around the economic effects, but also around some of the unanticipated benefits. You had, the Treasury Secretary talking about some of the additional revenue that could come in through these, about $300 billion in the next year. But you're also, seeing some of the reaction to countries that have already inked trade deals. You have China inking a trade deal, preliminary agreements. You have UK inking a preliminary agreement. And so there's been a little bit of a path for countries that are worried about being thrown, into this perilous situation where these tariffs hit. Of course, we've seen the deadline moved back twice now. First, it was deferred 90 days from April 9th to July 9th. Now we're seeing another deferment until August 1st. So what's that indicating? That's indicating that a lot of these countries Trump really wants to strike a deal with. The UK deal was something that was crafted in order to avoid these higher auto tariffs, these higher steel and aluminum tariffs, these things that would have been crippling to both economies, but once the trade deal is worked out and once some of those disparities are lessened that, Trump's advisors have talked a lot about, this is something that he wants to agree to. It's something that the other nations want to agree to. And so my advice to, Australia would be to find some of those ways in which they can emulate these trade deals that have already been struck with UK, with China. In the case of the UK, you saw all it took for them to lower their, auto tariffs was for them to say, hey, we're going to take some more US beef. So,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be something, identical to that, but there's clearly different imports and exports that can be discussed and worked through and come to some sort of an agreement between these parties.
We'll see what Australia can put on the table. Thanks so much for your time, Josh Christenson from the New York Post.